Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War Frontline update for what is now the 20th of July 2024. It's past midnight, I should be in bed, but I need to do this mapping update partly because I have a very busy day tomorrow, Saturday. So I'm going to have some inconsistent outputs later today. So I'm out and about, so sorry about that. However, I do have a scheduled interview with Stephen Bendal, and I will be able to get out at least one news video today. Okay, so let's look at the frontline update. If you don't know what the lines on that mean, please check out the key on the screen at the moment. Something else I'm going to use going forward, hopefully, is on my ATP Distilled website that Benny Pie has put together for me, or for us really. There will be the ISW AI he's jigged AI hopefully going forward to be able to on a daily basis take the Institute for the Study of War daily report, and although that is already like a summary of events, it's going to distill it even more into sort of key points and anecdotes and additional points of note. Now, as it happens today, there's a lot that's been going on the front line, but no like anecdotes and things. There's something here that a Ukrainian platoon commander who fought in Krinky described the Russian attacks there as meat assaults with 7 to 8 attempts a day. He noted a decrease in the size of Russian assault groups, attributing this to high casualties and low morale among Russian personnel. So that's an interesting little nugget there. But across all of the front line, there are just grinding increases of Russian territorial control. They are gaining right across the lines. Now, there are no Ukrainian gains as of the last 24 hours, so this is all quite challenging for the Ukrainians. If we go to the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatova to Kreminna down here, you can see, okay, there's a few places where they are attacking, but actually we've seen over time that they are just trying to squeeze more and more westwards along this whole front, really trying to get up to the Zherebets River. So the river here, there are lots of these sort of ponds, waterways there, or ponds and reservoirs. Then it turns into a smaller river as it comes up to Makivka. Now, if you remember, they've already got over the river up here, Novovodyanye, Karmazinivka, Kovalivka up there on that the watercourse as it goes to the north. You've got the Oskil River much further back, much more significant river, and they will struggle, I think, to get there. But here is an area that they are really trying hard to take. We'll get to there in a second. Just to say there's a small increase in control along this railway line that is south of Ivanivka there. Just around Kislivka, and they're pushing on their deep state map, and Andrew Perpetua have the Russians pushing to the west in that area. No change in Vovchansk, by the way, and up the north here, I think there's still tough fighting going on there. Vovchansk itself is an absolute, quite literally a bomb site. It's been absolutely hammered over the last few months. Relatively quickly. I mean, it's been destroyed. Andrew Perpetua's live stream is talking about this, destroyed much quicker than Bakhmut was. I know it's a little bit smaller, but still, like, the rate of destruction there's been pretty horrendous. And that's down to, with Bakhmut, the guided glide bombs weren't being used at that point, whereas they are now, and they're being used very effectively. Anyway, coming down to Makivka, Nevska, Terny area, the Russians are looking to push to the Zherebets River, and I think they're starting to have a little bit of momentum around here. They are fighting in Makivka, or on the outskirts of Makivka, and they're looking to push to the south of there, or to the west of Ploshchanka. And yeah, moving slowly towards Nevska. Andrew Perpetua has them pushing up fairly significantly along that's a sort of 6.5 kilometer stretch of the front there, so fairly wide, not and somewhat deep actually. Push forward there. The deep state map has them pushing even further forward in one particular area. So this is a challenge for the Ukrainians. Now, good news for the Ukrainians is once they reach the Zherebets River, it becomes quite difficult for the Russians here because you have these bluffs. It's a bit like the Oskil River up north by Kupiansk, where, yep, okay, great, you can get to the river and it's quite flat there, quite easy to take, but actually trying to move beyond that becomes a little more challenging. It's not only a case of getting across the river with mechanized equipment, but then you've got to fight your way up a bluff that the Ukrainians will be in control of and will have good sighting of the enemy from. So yes, they are moving to the west, and it's not a huge issue if they take all of this land here. The only problem with the Russians taking land is it's very difficult to get them out of there. You cede land to the Russians, and then you think, right, our job is then to take that land back at some point. And we've moved past the point of the Ukrainians, or indeed the Russians, being able to do these lightning counteroffensive like we saw up in the Kharkiv region. If you remember, the Russians were pushed back super quickly in this whole area. Like, the Ukrainians took all this area really very quickly, all things considered. And that's because there weren't these fortifications built everywhere, and there weren't these minefields that were laid ad infinitum, and drones weren't quite the prevalence that they are now. 2 years later, or a year and a half later, it is much more difficult to have those extensive gains. But when the Russians do grind out the gains that they take, yes, they might take huge losses, but the Ukrainians' hopes of taking that land back it's going to be a pretty difficult thing for the Ukrainians to achieve militarily. You could argue that the best hope is politically, but yes. So they are certainly losing some ground there. It's not massively important in that area, all things considered. What's possibly more challenging for the Ukrainians is this very large gain here, although that does come with some caveats. So here we have the gains around Sperna going to the west and northwest of Sperna. Sperna's over here, so west and northwest of this sort of march up the railway line towards Vyumka, sort of north of there, taking this entire area, according to Syriac maps, of up to Ivano-Derivka. In fact, if we go to Syriac maps, this is what they've said about Nevska, nothing too detailed there. But concerning the Ivano-Derivka area, the situation on the eastern front during the last week, the Russian army made significant advances southwest of Seversk, leading to the capture of the village of Ivano-Derivka in a series of trench systems south of it. Now, I think Syriac maps is deriving that conclusion from a house, or a bombed out remnants of a house somewhere around here, having a flag put on top of it. And it comes from a video that's somewhat dubiously cut. There are troops that are walking around there. You don't know whether they're Ukrainian or Russian, and then it gets cut, and then there's a flag on top which could have been dropped by a drone, the drone that's actually doing the recording. So if that's the main information they're getting that from, then might not be the case that the Russians have just suddenly taken all this land. But there isn't that much in this area for them to contend with the Russians, defensively speaking. But this is a real challenge. I mean, they could have got there, but it's going to be difficult for them to get a lot of mechanized equipment around here because it's not the easiest terrain. This is very challenging because actually, if you start, well, what Andrew Perpetua is saying in his live stream is there's this hill here that is just north of this area that they're supposed to have taken. That hill acts as like the highest point in this whole area. So if we sort of look where the Russians are coming from, this would be a real issue if the Ukrainians lost this. So, you've got great sight all the way around. And if the Russians are able to fully take that, that presents some real issues in a kind of domino effect that we talked about on previous places like sort of Pobjeda and Novelska and all these other little places that could, if they were lost at a particular time, have led on to these dominoes falling. Now, the Russians had been in control of this area, obviously, a couple of years ago and been pushed back since, but it is looking potentially dicey, although it will be very difficult for the Russians to take that, and they're probably better off coming from the north there. But Ukrainians have got fairly good units operating around here, around the Verkhnoko-Mianska area, fairly good with their drones. But if that falls, then Seversk is in trouble, and if it's this kind of domino effect. Then if Seversk falls, then you lose the Serebyansky forest, and then you basically lose all of this area up to here, and then the Russians are knocking on Slovyansk's door again, and that becomes a real challenge for the Ukrainians because that's a major objective for the Russians. And then you're thinking, goodness me, do they take all? But then you think of this large amount of land and the amount of troops that the Russians would need to be able to fulfill all of those objectives. However, they are potentially knocking on the door of that first sort of domino down here. So do the Ukrainians hold on to this hill come what may? How well stocked are these areas with troops and whatnot? So yeah, this is something to look out for. I think it's probably fairly well mined in this area, but there are potentials for the Russians to make some serious gains there. Then we come down to Chaziv Yar, and as we can see here, the three prongs of attacks: the Kalinivka area, the Canal micro-district, and south on the T0504 through Ivanivska. The Russians have kind of equalized all the way up to the canal now and have taken, according to Surat maps, a little bit of land to the north of Bodanivka. The other mappers don't have that yet. Andrew Perpetua is saying the Russians are actually taking some fairly significant casualties here. Like I've mentioned before, there are these two culvert areas. Culverts are where the canal goes underground and turns into a tunnel, and then there are some pipes above the ground. But either side of this northern culvert by Kalinivka, you've got trees either side. It's very difficult for the Russians to get mechanized equipment to there. But essentially, if the Russians are going to cross at that culvert or this other culvert down to the south here, just by that lower of the three prongs, then the Ukrainians know where they're going to be. And so as long as you've got enough indirect fire to hammer them, artillery and mortar, and then when you've got drones operating, then actually it could be quite challenging for the Russians to really move across the canal or across the culverts and start taking Chaziv Yar. So that's possibly why we haven't seen any really serious moves since the Russians have reached the canal, because actually it could be quite an expensive project for them to continue over the canal and take Chaziv Yar, or attempt to take it. So it could be that could stall for some time, and actually there are other places that would be easier for them and would give them a greater return on investment. So for example, they could pour 10,000 troops into Chaziv Yar, but actually if you take that hill I was just talking about and then you start approaching Seversk, then that will possibly have a greater knock-on effect than slogging through Chaziv Yar. But I don't know. They'll probably try both. When we come further to the south, we have the Touretsk area. Again, Surat map showing some fairly consistent gains here. So in the northern part through into Druzhba along the railway line, or north of the railway line. We have to the south a little bit, moving up through some of the urban areas there, just to the west of Shumi. And then you've got just down here, Zalizhny area, where Surat Maps has them taking control over a number of tailings heaps and whatnot from the mining industry around there, gaining control over that. Although not all the mappers agree with those, or in fact, none of the other mappers agree with Surat Maps around here. Suriyat Maps has a very charitable interpretation for the Russians in most of these places. And not to say it's not true, but the evidence hasn't been reaching a threshold that it leads the other mappers to think that the Russians have full control over those areas. But I would assume that the Russians are certainly fighting there. There'll be at least grey zones. And yeah, that's looking tough for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians have counterattacked in the New York area, which we showed yesterday in the mapping, where they've sort of pushed the Russians back in this part of that bridgehead up into New York, while the Russians are trying to push themselves further into the center of New York. But I think the Ukrainians, realizing that they need to put up a bit of resistance around here rather than continue cede territory to the Russians. Now, if we move to the west here, well, the Pokrovsk area rather than Avdiivka, they've kind of gone past Avdiivka now. So this is the Pokrovsk region. The Russians are trying to push to the north here, and that is a worrying one because they are getting closer and closer to interdicting that road, which is pretty important. But actually, no change for the mappers today, but there is a lot of activity there. They've succeeded in taking Novoalexandrivka over the last week or so and pushing north from there. And then we have the area of Sokil onto really Yevanivka and Prokhorez, and actually Suriyat Maps has them now fully in control of Prokhorez. Deep State Map, most of it, and actually I think Andrew Perpetua was just talking about this in his live stream with Gick and Erland, where they were, I think, saying that Prokhorez is pretty much Russian controlled now, so they're successfully moving through that area, and they are grinding out this territory. As another place is Novoselivka, Persia here, where according to Deep State Maps, Andrew Perpetua and Suriyat Maps, the Russians are making consistent gains into that settlement, and now they're getting towards operationally surrounding it, encircling it, at least on several of the sides there. But the Ukrainians, I think, are just trying to bleed the Russians as much as they retreat to the major defensive lines that are probably somewhere around where that blue line, that random blue line is. So just to remind you that the different areas are marked here basically in blue lines because you have to split. It doesn't like too many points in one polygon, so you have to split up into various polygons, and that means that sometimes there is just also some not just regional lines but random lines as part of the mapping gets chopped up. But anyway, randomly where that blue line is there, that doesn't otherwise signify anything, it is probably where the major fortifications are. And the Russians are pushing ever westwards here, and the Ukrainians will eventually reach the hopefully very well built defenses that include concrete structures and whatnot, and they'll need fewer people to defend those, and it'll be just easier for the Ukrainians. But of course you get this same situation that I was talking about earlier, where the more of this land that the Ukrainians cede to the Russians, then the more difficult it is to militarily overcome in reverse, and B, the more the Russians have leverage over if it does come to negotiations. But yeah, so the Russians have made those gains in that area there, all along that sort of Pokrovsk region. Then when we come down past Novoselivka, Persia, and to this area here by the Kharlivka Reservoir, the Russians are making some gains just north of there as well, and that has led to them looking like they're going to take all of this land here and then really push the Russians, the Ukrainians, out of the Kharlivka area. So that's on the cards. Hasn't happened yet, but they're continuing to push, and there is lots of activity all along the front line as well, it has to be said. Although there aren't any other changes, it is the case that the Russians are pushing in Krasnohorivka, they're probably going to take all of this area at some point. Just depends, again, how they're doing for mobilization, how thinly spread they are out along the front. But the Ukrainians themselves, yes, they are having some success in mobilizing at the moment. But of course, you have your lead time between mobilizing, training, equipping, and getting those troops to the front line. So we shall see if that has an effect going forward. Of course, they've got, for example, the French are training up 2,100 troops in September time. That'll take a couple of months and should be equipping them with mainly French equipment. But again, that's months and months away, isn't it? Anyway, Krasnohorivka, Mariinka, no change, but it's difficult around there, and Novomykhailivka as well. So although not here, but just south of here, the Russians have had an expensive time taking Novomykhailivka, and they seem to be, and as well having an expensive time trying to take Vuhledar several times previously. And it seems that they're now trying to operate in this middle section between the two places to try and interdict this road between Vuhledar and Konstantinivka. They are doing, as Andrew would say, they're YOLOing. You only live once. They are hurtling down these roads in trying to reach the road, and in fact they have pretty much reached the road but been blown up and destroyed and whatnot. But they're with like a couple of BMPs and got much further than you might have expected them to have got, and they've been foiled and stopped. But how much longer will it take before they do eventually take that road? So that is a slight concern. Because the Russians obviously don't have too much concern for the lives of their soldiers, so they happily just send them in vehicle after vehicle to reach there as and when they can. No changes to the rest of the front line at all, but there is heavy fighting in the Staromyrsky, Uruzhainy area. The Ukrainians have pulled out of Uruzhainy, as it says here. Velika Novosilka, Ukrainian forces are withdrawn from Uruzhainy after a prolonged Russian shelling, indicating Russian forces have likely captured the settlements. And here there's been a massive motorcycle, looks like the charge of the Light Brigade on motorcycles. There's some footage, I think I've got that ready for you for tomorrow, of the Russians using like quite a large number of motorcycles to attack in this area. I don't know whether that's been a successful use of that or what, but certainly a lot of motorcycles being used in a kind of Mad Max frenzy. Anyway, yes, so that is the rest of the front line being fairly static, but it's actually pretty active. But there are, like, the whole of the east does seem to be really active, from the very north down to the very south of it. And I think the Ukrainians are, like it has been said, and I've said a number of times, this is the most difficult point for the Ukrainians will be now. They've said for a long time it'll be sort of July, August time. That'll be when the Russians make their most gains, and that seems to be what is taking place at the moment. The Ukrainians really need more air support. They really need more shells. They really need more mortars and mortar bombs. These things are coming eventually, but they could do with them now. And of course, they just need an awful lot of boots on the ground. It would really help if they could take out the Russian air bases that supply supply the front line with close air support in terms of those guided glide bombs that do so much damage and are continuing to do so much damage. But yeah, so really, I think challenging for the Ukrainians. The question is always, how much longer can the Russians keep going? Is this them throwing everything and the kitchen sink at the front line in the hope that they make as much gain as they can before the summer closes and it all starts getting a little bit too muddy? Just trying to see if there's anything else worth mentioning. Yep, Krinky, withdrawal from Krinky is confirmed. Just continued assaults in all the directions. And and yeah, nothing else for the front line that I need to share with you there. But that's really a great resource going forward. This is going to be for me, and hopefully will save me some time, because time is of the essence for me. Yeah, that's the end of the Frontline update. Really appreciate all of your support, guys. Thank you so much. Take care, and I'll speak to you soon.